Electricity Minister Dr. Kgoshientsho Ramokgopa will present his plan to expand power transmission to Cabinet next month. He laid out numerous problems faced in expanding the grid, including a skills shortage and a hefty 200 billion rands bill during a financing seminar. For more on this, we're joined now by energy expert Chris Yelland. Chris, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. It's not the first time that the Minister, now Minister of Electricity, when you are still heading up the investment portfolio in the presidency, he raised this issue. But basically what he's saying is that infrastructure in South Africa is dilapidated. It's at a critical stage, whether it be power, whether it be rail, whether it be water reticulation, whether it be roads, hospitals, whatsoever. What is needed right now is private investment to come on and help government pretty much fix this problem. It will take years, but at least the government will have a partner with money to be able to do that, because the financial situation of government currently is quite undesirable. Will the private sector bite?
Yeah, look, firstly just to say that we're talking here about the transmission grid. And the transmission grid is not actually dilapidated. I would say, though, the investment in the grid has been somewhat neglected over the last decade. Money has been diverted to Medupi and Kusile, the power generation problems. And that has caused a lot of money to be diverted from the transmission grid. So where we are at the moment is the transmission grid is performing quite well, but it's been underinvested, and there are growing transmission grid constraints in the building of new generation capacity that needs to be connected to the grid. There are issues because access to the grid is limited.
Yeah.
They need new substations. They need to upgrade transmission lines, and they also need new transmission lines to cater for a very significant increase in the number of generators connecting to the grid, especially renewable energy generators. So Eskom doesn't have the money. They produced a transmission development plan that needs several 100 billion rands in the next 10 years. Eskom doesn't have the money or the balance sheet to fund this. And neither, frankly, does government. So one's got to look to the private sector. And in the private sector, there isn't a money problem. There is significant resources of finance. The question is to look at the business model to ensure that there's a good business case for these investments. And I think this is what government is grappling with, but there are solutions on the horizon.
Yeah.
And if you look at the discussions that took place today, it was really involving the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.
Yeah.
And therein lies the ability to raise significant amounts of public money, whether it's from pension funds, whether it's through public-private partnerships, whether it's through financial institutions, and whether it's through investments from the person in the street owning shares. There is a significant opportunity to raise significant amount of capital. In fact, money is not the problem.
Yeah.
There are other problems like skills,
yes,
and there are problems, for example, in the supply chain of equipment like transformers,
right,
and switchgear, substations, protection equipment, cables, overhead lines, steel, all these supply chains of these materials. There are significant shortages globally, and the problem, is harnessing not only the money but also the supply chain to supply the equipment.
So giving private companies concession is one of the options that the government is looking to raise infrastructure investment, or in this case, expansion investment. And generally, the problems that we run across here are political. One, it's the privatization of the grid, which is probably going to come up. And how do you navigate that space as the electricity minister?
Absolutely right. The whole ideological issue around the private sector involvement is very real. There is a significant distrust, apparently, between government and the private sector, and this needs to be overcome. I think one of the business models that is being looked at is the concessioning out of particular transmission corridors. These are stretches of transmission line, either existing corridors or existing corridors that need upgrading and investment, and in fact new corridors that are new transmission lines, 765 kV, 400 kV, 275 kV transmission lines. And there I can just point to an analogy of the road infrastructure, where concessions are given to new companies which are special purpose vehicles. That could be private-public partnerships. They could be have shareholders comprising financial institutions, pension funds, and construction companies, civil engineering companies. This is in the roads business, where a concession is given to a special purpose vehicle company established to build, own, and operate these corridors, these transportation corridors. Now, exactly the same business model can be applied to transmission grids, where you concession out the rights to operate, and you effectively toll the usage of these transmission grids for transferring energy from one point to another. And this is a model that has been proven in both electricity and in transportation, and it can raise very significant finance and skills and capacity, from the construction companies, from private sector, and money from the financial sector.
So let's talk about those mechanics. I mean, firstly, if the car powership situation is anything to go by, I'm sure there are environmental assessment issues, how that process is being handled, and so on and so forth. But we were also at a point where we were debating, for example, how long are they here? 20 years, 40 years, 50 years. Same with concessions. It will be a debate on what is the giving back period. Is it 20 years? Is it 40 years? And are we going to allow the private sector to be taking profits from this this infrastructure that's supposed to be state-owned for 40 years? What's a good time?
Look, these transmission infrastructure has typically a relatively long life, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and one needs to be able to recover the upfront expenditure and amortize it over a period, over the life of that asset. I don't see anything wrong with a long-term agreement. In the case of car powerships, it's completely different. Car powerships is an emergency procurement to deal with a short-term emergency, and therefore you shouldn't enter into a long-term contract to deal with a short-term emergency. And this is completely different in the case of national highway that needs to be financed and capital recovered over the lifetime of the asset. Similarly with a transmission grid. And in terms of environmental authorization, that, of course, these are not assets that generate pollution and carbon dioxide over the life of that project. So it's a completely different situation to a generation project, which does emit pollution.
But I'm sure, I mean, we are putting up huge, massive power lines that in some instances are going to be crossing through some townships, and you might find communities that are saying, well, we were not consulted. It's going to be a whole other fight, I suppose, in some instances.
Certainly, the land rights to these corridors, government and whoever is the owner or builder, owner, operator of these concessions is going to have to procure the land rights, these servitudes across which the transmission lines operate. And it is a problem. It is a slow process. A lot of the land is owned by farmers and community land, and they all want to extract some rent from this process. And that slows things down. But I think one's really just got to put together a good business case, and the finance will be there. And we do, there are skills and private sector capabilities, not only locally, but also internationally, that can bring this to the table.
Chris Yelland, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on.